Hello, welcome to the SideQuest RPG podcast. We're back. It's been a little bit. I'm your host, Smug, and this week, as always, I'm joined by Mindz.
How's it going?
And this is session 3. I know it's been a bit, but this is a place where we can sit down, relax, we can have a conversation, and just talk about D&D, RPGs, and everything that we have that's in between. It's been a bit. I got sick for one of those weeks. Had a really sore throat. It's very difficult to record a podcast with a sore throat. And then last week, Elden Ring came out, and we tried to record early, and then you ended up with a meeting, and then I ended up kind of dipping, which is kind of shame on me, but I mean, it's a fun game. I'm sorry. But it's been a real rocky 3 weeks for both of us, mostly me. But we're back. We're keeping with it. And anything else you want to add or talk about before we get started?
No, I mean, welcome back.
Yeah, it's nice to be back in full swing with a voice that I can actually use.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you. You fixed everything. But this week we wanted to start probably just a two-part, 2 episodes back to back.
Or 3.
Maybe 3, depending on what we can think of. On different ways to play, specifically in D&D. Afterward,
different archetypes of characters, if you will.
Correct, archetypes, but specifically in combat. So last week, or last session, and the session before, we talked about world building and playing your own character, making a new character, deciding what you want to do and how to play them in a role play standpoint. And for the next 2, possibly 3 sessions, we're going to be breaking down on a very broad level combat archetypes, melee, ranged, magic, and things along that nature, utility even. So that is the plan. And for this one, we are going to be breaking down melee, up front, close and personal.
Indeed. And
yes,
with anybody that has played D&D or anybody who hasn't played D&D, you have the 3 different types. They're not quite the holy trinity of MMOs that everybody seems to think. You do have melee, you have ranged, and you have magical damage, which can be both melee and ranged. But the melee classes in particular are the barbarian, the monk, the fighter, and the rogue. Now, there are alternative builds and different subclasses that will allow certain classes to become a melee class. But for the first part of this episode, we should be talking about those 4 classes: the barbarian, the monk, the fighter, and the rogue, because they are specifically, or most of the time, being used as just a straight up physical brawler.
Yes.
Whether that be using a 2-hander or 2 one-handers or a sword and shield. Typically, all their damage is going to be physical, and it's going to be from a melee range.
Correct. With exceptions in subclasses and things of that nature.
Always.
So.
And I guess the first class that we should probably dive into is the barbarian, the rager.
Yeah. The most simple, straight up. I say simple. It is a little easier to handle than learning how to play a fighter, even though fighter is like the generic class. I think barbarian is more simple for those that really just want to play the game and hit stuff. They're new, and they really don't like the flashy style of some of the other melee classes, and they just want to get in there and hit things, do dumb stuff. They really fit that theme and archetype for me. But there are subclasses and things that change that if you want to continue off that.
Yeah, well, I guess before we get into the actual nuances of the different classes, what are the strengths and weaknesses of melee? Melee, for the most part, will be doing a lot of damage with extra attacks and just literally beating face.
Right.
Was it smorking, I think is the term that was used in Hearthstone and a number of other different RPG type games, or you're just the dumb,
Yeah.
you're a smart orc, and smart orcs they see things and they smash things.
Right. If it breathes, it must die.
Yes. And the barbarians, I mean, typically all four of the classes that I've mentioned get an extra attack at level 5. They are one of the classes that if you're swinging and you're swinging a big two-hander, you're going to be doing a lot of damage. And then at level 5, you get to do it twice per attack action. Barbarians get extra damage from raging, which basically, whenever you get into a fight, you're going to get mad and you're going to do extra damage, and you can automatically give yourself advantage on attacks. So you roll 2 different dice and you take the highest one of the 2. And they literally are meant to just go in and chop things up or smash things and just do a lot of damage. They basically Hulk out. That is what a barbarian class is.
Yeah. Hulk smash is the goal of a barbarian. There are different play styles to it. One of my favorites, one of the players I had in my campaign was playing a primal barbarian. I don't remember the second word. I want to say it's primal something barbarian. Forgive me. It's been a while.
There's no primal.
He had something that gives him fire powers as a barbarian. He has like waves of fire that go around him. May have been his subclass, his choice in his subclass. I'm sorry for the my brain has been fried today.
It's all right. There's wild magic, which allows you to add magic on top of your swings and everything else. The closest thing that I can think of is Storm Herald. And Storm Herald is something that you basically pick the desert, the sea, or the tundra, and then you get an effect based on that. Obviously,
Yes.
The tundra is going to be ice. Desert is going to be fire damage, where you gain resistance to fire damage. You don't suffer the effects of extreme heat. You can touch a flammable object and set it on fire.
Correct. Oh, I know what it is. His primal path. Barbarians choose a primal path. That's their quote-unquote subclass.
That is their subclass. Yes.
That's what I was thinking of. I heard primal something. He's playing a Storm Herald, and he was choosing fire.
Desert.
As what he was doing. So.
Yes. The 3 most common ones that I've seen are the Totem Warrior. Most people pick Totem of the Bear because at level 3, that gives you an immense amount of utility. It kind of gives you extra temporary hit points when you're transformed into a bear, but you also gain resistance to all damage.
Correct.
All non-magical damage, I think. And then later on, you get resistance to all damage. So you get half damage on any damage that you're taking while raging.
Correct.
That is far and away the most popular barbarian build that there is.
It is very powerful.
And again, when you're up in the face of 6 guys surrounding you and you're doing cleave attacks and this and that and everything's hitting you, obviously that's going to be very, very powerful.
Correct.
The next one that I see a lot is a Zealot Barbarian. And Zealot Barbarians get Divine Fury, where basically when you're raging, the first creature you hit takes an extra d6 plus half your barbarian level just on top of it. So again, when you're doing that, and then you get your extra attacks, you get your automatic advantage on hit. But the Path of the Zealot, the big kind of bonus that they get is that when you're raging, if you drop to 0 hit points, you don't go unconscious.
Yeah, you just go mind numb.
Yes, you still have to make your death saving throws, and you suffer the normal effects of taking damage. However, if you die based on your saving throws, you don't die until your rage ends. And then even if you have 1 hit point before your rage ends, you don't die.
Yeah.
So you can literally run into a battle, take down 3 guys, have the 4th and 5th guy kill you. But because you're still raging for another 2 or 3 turns, as long as you get healed for 1 hit point before those 2 or 3 turns is up and your rage ends, it's like you never died.
Yeah.
They are almost unkillable. And then finally, the Berserker one. The Berserker is
just hit more stuff.
Yeah, they are frenzy.
Hit stuff, hit stuff, hit stuff, hit stuff.
Yep. And the Berserker one is basically your reaction. Whenever you take damage from a creature within melee, you can use a reaction to make a melee attack against it. So I hit you, you hit me back, and I hit you as a reaction.
Yes.
So it's attack of opportunity, but if they hit you, which is, again, becomes very Blender-y, if you will.
Yes. So on the Barbarian, what do you think some of the noteworthy strengths are of the class as a whole? Not getting specific on the subclasses just for time's sake.
Of the class as a whole, it's doing an absolute metric ton of damage.
Correct.
Every turn, being consistent. I mean, every turn, if you're attacking for 2d6 and then you add 2d6, like Cormac in the Western Winds campaign, every turn he's attacking for up to 24 damage unless he crits each swing. So he'll swing, he'll take an attack action, he gets an extra attack. So he hits for up to 48 damage per swing or per attack action. And then he can get a third attack from a different item that he has. But so that's up to 72 up to 72 damage basically per turn.
Oh, Jesus.
The paladins in our group, they can almost match him until they run out of spell slots and they drop off. So that's kind of the difference between a barbarian and a paladin with extra attack. As for the weaknesses,
well,
go ahead.
Also I would like to add another strength is resistance to physical damage. I'm pretty sure the physical damage resistance is a barbarian trait, not a subclass trait. Certain subclasses give you more resistances than others, but physical, slashing, piercing, and bludgeoning is halved by barbarians as a basic feature, which as a DM, until you start getting into like level, I'd say 9-ish, it is fairly difficult to consistently throw realistic encounters that have enough magical effects to take a barbarian down, if that makes sense.
Yes,
because your goal isn't to kill them.
Add on to that,
yeah,
you also have unarmored defense as a barbarian.
Yes,
which is your dex plus con plus 10.
Correct.
So yeah, I mean,
you should be pumping con anyways, because you're a barbarian. You want more health, more swings, harder to kill. That's the whole point.
Yes, but if you're, again, like Cormac, who had 18 strength, 18 dex, and 20 con, he's sitting at 19 AC unarmored.
Correct.
And add in like a bracer of defense or cloak of protection, ring of protection, you're now at 23 AC with no armor on whatsoever.
Correct, which is difficult and powerful. But continuing on, what would you say a weakness is, or a few weaknesses?
Weakness, the first and foremost, is you have low intelligence and charisma, and you cannot save verse spells whatsoever unless you pick a specific one to put some extra stats into.
Yeah, so wisdom saves against certain spells are just very difficult to succeed unless
Mind
you just
flare spells, charisma spells,
a lot of aberration type
any of the
stuff.
mental abilities.
Yes.
Not to mention, if you don't have a magic weapon or a weapon that can do magic damage, you are going to be awful against high AC or high armored, high con monsters.
That is the weakness I was going to mention, that even if you have a magical weapon, you really only have 3 types of damage unless your DM gives you some kind of weapon that deals magical damage of some kind. Even with some of the subclasses, the magical damage, in my opinion, is not great. So you end up only doing bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing. And there are some creatures that are resistant to all forms of bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing, even if it's magical.
That is correct.
So,
I mean, then you also have some of the higher level ones that, have a whole bunch of AC, which is not a big deal because you're getting +9, +10, +13 hits eventually. But something like a Tarask, And I know Tarask is not very common in different campaigns and whatnot. But once you start getting into the higher level or the higher CR creatures and monsters, you start to lose a lot of your advantages because of all the resistances and the immunities.
Mm-hmm. And the last weakness I really want to point out for barbarians is there are, excluding some specific abilities for some of the many subclasses, you tend to have a very strong lack of area of effect. You are usually taking 3 people at once, only able to hit 1 or 2 at a time, depending on how many attacks you have, where the enemies are positioned. And even as a melee fighter, you know you have to get in there yourself. You have to run to the enemy, especially as a barbarian. The difference is there's no way to deal with true crowds if you truly get ganged up on. Your resistances help, and the high health pool usually helps. But in the end, if you're taking 5 guys at once, 5 enemies all around you, all swinging weapons at you, shooting arrows at you, you will eventually go down, especially with wisdom save spells and stuff like that. So that's the one weakness I truly see with barbarians, is that what we've already mentioned with the lack of magical damage and so on and so forth.
Yeah, they're dumb. They can't defend themselves against magical effects and magical abilities and spells. Like the saves are just, very, very difficult. You only have the few types of damage, and then you have lack of AoE for the most part. There are some classes that allow you to do that, but those are kind of the 3 glaring weaknesses.
Correct. All right, and then moving on to the monk. The monk is, in my opinion, as a DM, one of the hardest classes to DM for. They are very powerful. They don't have very many weaknesses. And we're going to delve into that just a little bit. So, do you have any starting thoughts on playing a monk from your end? I know you haven't played one, but...
I haven't played a monk at all. I haven't played with a monk at all. I just know the rumors that I've heard. Monks hit a lot. They don't do very much damage with each hit, but they stun every single turn. And they are extremely useful. They can move forever and a day. They can literally turn into the Flash. But yeah, I don't know much about them aside from that. I know that eventually they can use weapons as their fist weapons or as their monk weapons, and they can do, start doing a little bit more damage, but that's at the level 10 and higher.
Right. Well, one of the things that really stands out to me about monk and sets it apart from the others is what you mentioned, is that it's primarily a fist hand-to-hand combat type class. They are quick, agile, hard to hit. They don't have a huge health pool like the barbarian does, and they're not really resistant to a lot of things as a base class. But they also get unarmored movement from wisdom and dex together. So it's 10, or is it 8 plus wisdom plus dex, or is it 10 plus wisdom plus dex? I think it's 10 plus wisdom plus dex is the AC of the monk, which is fairly powerful because your wisdom is also your modifier for your stun. And the stun is very powerful. However, keep in mind that you can only do it once per turn. And that, or at least I believe you can only do it once per turn. That's how I house rule it anyways. And if your monk does not have the highest wisdom, it's not going to land against bosses. It's just not going to happen. It's a constitution saving throw, and it's just not that high of a DC that a boss is going to need to save against it.
Yeah, and that seems, it seems like that is the balance that people
Correct.
get. It's, you can stun almost everything except bosses.
Yeah, it's really good against humanoid. Even humanoid bosses, they really don't have that much con. but it's not very good against the monstrosities and stuff, and especially aberrations and things like that have high con. So,
yeah, which again is going to be one of their weaknesses, because
correct.
anything that, and because it's, as far as I know, it's all physical, correct?
No, at level 6, I believe, that is a base monk trait that your fists count as magical for the purposes of magical damage. But it is all physical, quote unquote. So it is bludgeoning, piercing, slashing. I think it's all bludgeoning for their fists. And they count as magical for the purposes of going past magical resistance. However,
That is your unarmed strikes, not
correct.
strikes with a weapon, though.
Your unarmed strikes.
Do monk weapons count as unarmed strike?
If it's an enchanted monk weapon, it does not count. Monk weapons don't count as unarmed strikes. So you can use your attack to get one hit with a monk weapon, which typically deals more damage in one hit. However, you can use your unarmed strikes and hit twice in one attack action.
Okay.
So the trade-off is 2 hits for slightly less damage, or 1 hit for possibly more damage. And some classes and subclasses for it allow you to augment those monk weapons. That's the trade-off with the monk weapons.
I see.
So you can augment your secondary. I don't remember which class it is, but there's one that if you land an attack with your monk weapon, you can augment your next unarmed strike and cause some kind of status effect. I don't remember what it is. But that is generally just information about monks. Monks are very up close and personal. They really want to run around the battlefield. I find that playing a monk, your goal is not to 1v1 the boss. Let the barbarian do that. He's got more health. He's got more resistances. I find the monk is really, really good at sprinting around the battlefield, doing a bunch of little chunks of damage to all the little guys. He is really good at crowd control, not because of his AoE, but because of his multiple small attacks.
Yeah, and I mean, that's kind of what the monks are known for, is specifically for that, flying around the battlefield, doing a little bit of damage here and there, and then stunning at least one thing.
Yes. I find that also monks make really good potion carriers. They have high AC. They're kind of hard to hit. So they typically live a good bit. Even if they don't have the highest health pool, it's hard to hit them. So I find that giving your monk most of your potions, he can literally spend one turn, sprint to an ally, and still have an action to give them a potion to get them back up, or to give them something, or to use a throwing potion. I find monks are very good at that in game. Better than clerics. Clerics don't have the movement for it, but they have the ranged healing. So give your melee healing items to the monk, because they can sprint and get to a friend. That's just one of the ways I like to play them. But I don't think there's anything else about monks. Monks are very overpowered. They run really fast. They have, I think, the highest base movement by like level 10, period. They have secondary, they can dash as a bonus action. They get nimble dodge, where they can, if they fail a dexterity saving throw, they succeed. And if they succeed the dexterity saving throw, they take no damage. It is very powerful, very hard to hit them, but they don't have the highest health pool. So when you do hit them, especially late game, it hurts. It really hurts them. Unlike the barbarian, I feel that monks thrive when surrounded by little guys. Conversely to the barbarian.
And they are, as you say, glass cannons.
Correct. Though, depending on your stat line or your class or your subclass, that can change. But generally, they are glass cannons, run in there, do a bunch of little bitty hits, a lot of little guys, or be a distraction and be annoying so that everyone else can do what they need to do. Continue.
I was going to say, don't they have another thing that gives them like feather fall?
Yeah.
kind of
Oh,
ability?
yeah. As long as they have a wall to touch, they can feather fall and take basically 0 fall damage. So they can't just like drop from the sky and like perish and like skydive to the ground. But if they jump out of a window, they can use the wall and like wall run their way down and take half fall damage, which is insane to not use a spell slot and just be something they can do. As a monk, that's not even a subclass. That's just something they can do. They're immune to poison, or at least resistant to it at a certain level. They stop aging at one point, which is just part of their base abilities. That's not a subclass thing. That's just a thing monks do when they hit like 18 or 19. They just don't age past that. So monks are very powerful. I, as a DM, firmly believe they are the most bullshit to have to DM for. Sorry for the language, but they can be fairly annoying because they're hard to control. And I don't mean that in a bad way. The DM's goal is not to control, but they can take the opposite of the barbarian, where the barbarian's just hard to take down. The monk is going to do everything in its power and just flip your encounter on you if you don't give enough health to people, if they get lucky on their rolls, if you position your NPCs in just the wrong way. They can really turn the tide of a fight just by existing and moving around. So I find them, as a player, they are really good at just moving.
One other thing that they get, and it's a little more of the RP thing as opposed to combat, but they are able to they're not able to speak every language, but they're able to understand every language, and anyone who can speak a language can understand them at level, I think it was 13.
Is that just a monk thing?
That's just a monk thing.
If so, that's really good for RP level 2. I still stand by monks, really powerful, but they are not without faults. The strengths of them we've already kind of mentioned. They're really fast, they move a lot, they hit a lot, but they don't hit for very hard, so they're good at dealing with little guys and being a distraction. That is a lot of their strengths. Hard to hit, the things that hold them back, and weaknesses of playing that style is a lack of hit points. They have a pretty high hit die. I believe it's a D10. It might be a D8, but they have fairly good hit pool to take damage from, but it's not as high as some others.
Yeah, it is a D8 as opposed to a barbarian's D12.
Correct. So they do have a little smaller of a health pool, and you're not absolutely pumping Constitution as a monk because your main damage is your wisdom and your dex. Constitution right after that, in my opinion, and then your other things wherever you want them. So when you do get hit, you're going to feel it. You get resistances from your subclasses sometimes, and you have unarmored movement, which makes you really fast, and you have unarmored defense, which makes you pretty hard to hit. But that's the only real downside. The last downside they think they have, other than specific subclasses and specific abilities, is range. Some barbarians have range built into their kit. Some other melee classes have some kind of ranged ability. The monks have the speed to close the gap, but outside of specific cases, they really don't have more than a 5-foot range. And that is a real problem with some players who really want some diversity, and their only thing they can do in combat is run around and hit stuff. And to some players, that gets boring. One of my players in my current campaign, we just had to redo his entire kit as a monk. We are doing a custom subclass for him, a lightning caller dragonborn monk is his whole theme. And he has range. He has lightning damage built into his repertoire. The problem and trade-off with that is he's doing lightning damage. And that's the only element he gets access to. So his only options are bludgeoning and lightning. If something's resistant to lightning damage, he really can't do nothing. So their weaknesses are 1 to 2 damage types and a low health pool, and they are pretty much strictly melee in outside of certain circumstances.
Well, yes. So the other thing that they have is if you have like a padded armor or a gambeson or something like that, that gives you the reduction, just a flat reduction to all hits. Again, with the unarmed strikes, I mean, not only are you trying, do you have to hit twice as much for half the damage? Is if you miss one of those attacks, you lose out on damage. But it also, if you hit and somebody has the flat -1 to damage, and you're hitting with a D4 for 2 hits, that's automatically a reduction of 2 damage, as
Yes.
opposed to a reduction of 1 damage if you're just to hit once with a D8 instead of 2 with the D4.
And I do believe it's like level 6, maybe 7, where it goes up to a D6 damage die and then eventually a D8 at some point. So eventually they do swing
5, D8 is 11.
Yeah. So eventually it does go up, but especially early game, monks feel kind of weak, and then something flips. Depends on the game, depends on the subclass, depends on the play style, depends on the player. But at some point, your monk will flip from being fairly useless in combat to very powerful, very useful, and very utility and damage heavy. Not utility in the sense of crowd control, status effects, and items, but utility is in just being able to take focus away from backline and even the head tank. So they're very good 1v1 against humanoid enemies, and their last weakness, which I touched on earlier, is enemies with high hit pools and constitution.
Or resistance to stun.
Resistance to stun, too. So immunity and resistance to stun, high constitution and high HP pools are not good for monks. They really excel at picking off little guys, doing chip damage, and being a distraction in terms of combat, in my opinion. Now, some people may be able to play them differently, and some subclasses change that, but that's the general overview, in my opinion, of a monk. You have anything to add in terms of strength and weaknesses?
No, I think you just about covered it.
All right. Well, if that's everything for monk, we can actually move on to fighter. And fighter is a class I have a love-hate relationship with.
You love it and it hates you, or you hate it and it loves
you? It's a little odd. I love the idea of having a fighter. However, I'm also very used to and been playing long enough that when I see a fighter, I'm skeptical until the player proves that they're not generic fighter number 176 from memory lane. So I am very skeptical of people who just walk up and say, I'm playing a human fighter. You got to give me a reason, and it's got to be interesting. And there are some things as a base fighter that I just find rather boring. And you really have to make the character and the RP stand out from the combat, in my opinion.
Yeah, that sounds like a good idea. I mean, I know pretty much everyone who plays D&D, their first character tends to be a human fighter.
Correct.
And I think there's a reason for that, though. I mean, my first character was a human fighter. It was suggested by the DM. But mainly it's because I was trying to figure out something to do. I wanted to build, my thought process and concept was building a rogue or a fighter, one of the two, with a shield. And I would go literally cannonball myself into enemies, knocking them down with shield slam.
Yes.
And then as I'm pinning them down, laying on top of the shield on top of them, I would then stab them for sneak attack damage, on my subsequent turns.
Correct.
And my DM told me, okay, well, this is a Lost Minds of Phandelver module, which is half homebrew, so it's not quite a module. But we are following the story. And he said, well, what about this? What about you make a dex fighter that's kind of half fighter, half rogue? You kind of get the same thing, but instead of being strength based, you can be dex, which is good for your dexterity saving throws, and with a rogue you get the higher sneak attack. But instead of shield slamming, you can use trip attack
Battle Master, I'm assuming.
as a battle master.
Yeah.
So I ended up doing that, and I could not have been happier with the choice. I'm glad that he suggested that I go fighter versus the rogue, just because A, I'd never played before, and B, it kind of fits in.
Correct.
As a human dex fighter, I was being brought in midway through the campaign, and I was brought in as a member of the Red Brands, who are swashbucklers and brigands and everything else in the story. So as I was brought in, it kind of fit the theme. I made my backstory. I grew up in the Dragon Coast, and my father was a shady being of sorts, but he was a good man. And because of that, he taught me the ways, how to defend myself with a sword.
Right.
So I learned. I grew up starting to, to fight with sword play and everything else. I kind of base it off of Syrio from Game of Thrones.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
And because of that, I got really good with my rapier because I am a rogue as well. And I am a 2-weapon fighter battle master rogue. So you get the extra attack, you get the superiority dice, and you also get sneak attack. So my thought is, now that I'm battle master, I'm going up to swashbuckler so I can get the fancy footwork, I think it is.
Yeah.
But as I was growing up, originally, my thought, I knew how to fight. I was, I grew up with a shady background. I was always hiding from people and learned how to pick locks and this and that. So I kind of had a rogue backstory. But my
Learn
story
to
was
fight
that
manually, like a fighter.
I learned to fight. Yes, I learned my fighting style as a fighter. But I also was a bounty hunter, so I would chase people down, and that's why I needed to know how to defend myself.
Ooh, okay.
So that's why when I settled down in a small town of Phandalin, I joined the Red Brands as a brigand to kind of say, okay, well, yeah, I'm providing protection and this and that, and like the whole bounty hunter fighting backstory kind of fit. And even though it's just a generic human fighter, it was a way that I can, get my
Be different.
I could get my individuality. My
Yes.
personality stands out from something else.
Correct.
But at the same time, yes, I'm a human fighter. I get the extra attack. I get, the sneak attack from the rogue for multi-class. But there's not much to it. It's very simple.
Yeah.
I get in a fight. I swing. And then I have extra dice that I could roll that can give me some sort of utility. So it's not just a barbarian rage and roll dice to hit, roll dice to hit, roll dice to hit.
Yeah. And that's one of the things about the fighter is just they're simple. That is the best thing about the fighter. They really don't have a crap ton of abilities to do as actions other than attack and modulate their attacks with their different abilities. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
So they don't have 700 spells that all have different descriptions. They have to remember what they do, and you have to track your spell slots. So you have to track how many rages you have. You get X amount of abilities or superiority die per rest, and each of them you roll to do bonus damage or something on top of something else you do. It's really simple.
And that is a subclass.
And that's just the subclass. And that is my one gripe with fighter, is the subclasses. I have played 3 of the subclasses, and I've seen most of them played other than a couple of the new ones, if there are any newer ones. And the only ones I really thought had any merit are the Battlemaster and the Arcane Knight, I think. I don't remember what the exact name is.
Echo Knight or Eldritch Knight?
Eldritch Knight. The Echo Knight is new to me at least. The Eldritch Knight, the one that gets a magical weapon. Those are the only 2 that really stood out to me in terms of customization and the ability to change how it plays outside of RP. The champion really feels lackluster to me. The samurai is kind of meh, in my opinion. It really doesn't have anything that you would choose over a battle master. And if you want some magic damage, you go the Eldritch Knight or the Echo Knight, which I think is a critical role subclass.
No, Echo Knight is from Explorer's Guide to Wildemount.
Wildmount, yeah, that's critical role.
Okay.
Yeah, so
but yeah, it has its free Misty Step, and it basically it is a teleporting. It's very similar to Nightcrawler from X-Men.
Yeah, and it is different enough that it has its unique play style that isn't run in there, swing sword. Not that that's bad, but in my opinion, fighters suffer from needing some kind of character thrown on top of it. Otherwise, they are fairly boring in combat, and that's not a bad thing if to a new player. Just because you're simple and kind of boring does not mean it's bad, but to a longtime player, fighters can seem very, very lackluster unless you put some kind of spin on it that makes it your own.
Well, the other thing is the fighter can give you so much utility. So
Yes.
if you don't know what you're doing or don't know what your class is and want to play something that is, that a gap needs to be filled, a fighter is a great choice because
Correct.
you have subclasses like the Banneret, which is more a utility and a support type fighter. You're still doing some damage, but also when you use Action Surge to get the extra thing. That's one of their biggest keys of fighters, Action Surge.
The Action Surge.
But when you use your Action Surge, somebody else can get a free attack then and there.
Correct.
But again, we're not talking about the subclasses right now. We're focusing on just the fighters for their strength and their weaknesses. The fighter, like the barbarian and the monk, get an extra attack. So whenever you take the attack action, you swing a second time.
Correct.
The fighters not only get a free heal that you can use on your bonus action called Second Wind, which is your hit dice, I think, which is a D10 plus your con. But you also get Action Surge, which means you can take another movement, action, bonus action, or free object interaction, which will allow you to run up to somebody, swings, extra attack, swing with your offhand, or use your Second Wind, use Action Surge, and then use a second attack action to get 2 more swings with your weapon.
Yeah.
So in one of my characters now, my human fighter, I'll run up and I will swing, extra attack with my offhand as a bonus action, Action Surge, swing, extra attack. So I've got 5 different attacks on one turn.
Yeah.
And if I crit or if I get anything else, it starts to get nutty. That's why Tristan, again, is called the blender.
But as a whole, the strengths of fighter and the play styles to think about. As a summary, I believe the play style of most fighters is kind of just run in there and do what you can. You have abilities to augment your attacks. You have Action Surge to give you another one or give you another one of your abilities. You have bonus action abilities, especially on Battle Master, which is just probably, in my opinion, one of the best subclasses for it. And you really just kind of be there, you do damage, you soak up some damage, you have a decent hit pool, you have decently high armor class, depending on what armor style you go with. If you want to be heavy armor, you have a higher armor class because of your armor. If you want to be dex, you have a high armor class because of your dex. So it kind of just depends on you and your playstyle and how you make the fighter your own. The strengths of them are what I mentioned. They have decently high health pools. They can have decently high armor class. They hit a lot, and they can do a lot in one turn. The biggest strength of the fighter, in my opinion, is their simplicity to start with.
Yeah, simplicity and the action surge because of that extra burst of damage.
Yeah,
Because you need that to keep up with a barbarian who has the same type of abilities, but they're swinging a 1d12 or 2d6 great handed or a great weapon. And
correct.
you, as a fighter, you can have that. But if you're a dual wielding, you need that action surge to get those extra couple swings. But you also can do a single turn. That is, you have a higher potential of damage than a barbarian. Granted, you need a short rest, I think, for action surge to come back.
Yeah,
So so you can't just sit there and keep up with the barbarian the entire time.
right.
As for weaknesses, the biggest thing that I find with my human fighter is magic damage.
Yeah, unless you're playing the Echo Knight or the Eldritch Knight that I can think of, you really only have physical damage. Whereas monks and barbarians, a couple of their subclasses, and they have a lot of other strengths that really make them shine outside of just hitting things. Barbarians able to soak up damage, monks able to run around and have all this utility. Fighters really suffer from only really having physical damage and not being able to change their damage types too easily.
Yeah.
That
I
that
mean,
is the big one.
we're level 7, and I just recently found a magic scimitar, which does magical damage for the purpose of bypassing immunities and resistances and all that.
Right.
But until then, I mean, we'd be going up against, you know, a shielded hobgoblin who would take the defense stance for their action, and they had an AC of 19 or 20, I think it was. And at level 4, I didn't have extra attack, and my plus 2 attack was only like 5, so I couldn't hit anything. And here we have a hexblade paladin and another spellcaster, and they're casting searing flame, they're casting um what is it, hellish rebuke and eldritch blast, and I felt useless,
Right.
absolutely useless
Yeah,
in 3 or 4 different fights.
until you get that magical weapon. So you're really relying on your DM to give you the ability to do comparable damage in later fights because of the resistance to magic and the resistance to physical damage without magical weapons.
Yes, once you get a magical weapon and once you get to level 5, then you start to come into your own, and the whole fighter archetype starts to come online.
Right.
I think fighters are the slowest start of, well, with the exception of possibly monk, because again I haven't played a monk, but I think fighters are one of the slowest melee classes to bring online and actually feel good.
Right. And to couple with that, that's not a terrible thing for newer players. That is really good. It's simple. It's not necessarily one note, but it really helps them get in that feel of combat. And because of their decently high health pool early, their decently high AC early, they do decent damage early game, but they don't have a lot to do. That it really nails home how combat works for newer players. That is the biggest strength, yet also the biggest weakness, in my opinion, on the fighter. So,
All right.
if there's nothing else to add to that, what about rogues? I have never truly played a rogue in D&D 5e or even 4e. 4.5, never really played a rogue. I like playing rogues and magical rogues in other video games and things of that nature, but I have never sat down and played a rogue myself. What do
I
you believe is the play style that you like to go for in Dungeons and Dragons for rogues?
Well, the rogue that I have is the rogue battlemaster, and I play him much more like a rogue that can handle his own in a fight.
So a rogue with some tankiness to him.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, a rogue with some damage to him.
Okay.
Rogues' biggest strengths are the fact that they can sneak around and stealth and they can pick locks. That in itself is a huge bonus. For the other part of it is they get sneak attack. So if you're attacking with advantage, or if you have an ally within 5 feet of your target, you start to deal a lot of damage once per turn, or once per round, um, of sneak attack. And sneak attack, when you start out, is 1d6. When you get to level 3, it becomes 2d6, then 3d6, then 4d6, et cetera, all the way up to, I think it's 7d6 that you can get.
Yeah.
Just because you hit them.
Right.
You don't have to do anything. You don't have to trigger anything. If you attack with advantage, or somebody on your allies is within 5 feet of your target, you get that extra damage.
Correct.
So rogues want to be on the front line, but not in the direct line of fire.
Yes.
So you want your tank to run past somebody and run into a group of people and have everybody turn around and attack them. So you come up and literally backstab them, or just attack from the side, whatever it is. But not only do you want to be that close, but you also want to be able to give yourself advantage. There is like one of the strengths is that you can get sneak attack from both ranged and from melee. But
Correct.
since this week we're focusing mainly on the melee, you can hit somebody with sneak attack, and then if somebody provokes an attack of opportunity from you, you also can get sneak attack on that attack as well. Sneak attack is only once per turn, but that means your turn, on the enemy's turn, on the enemy's turn, on the enemy's turn, on the enemy's turn.
I believe the way I run it is once per round if I have one in my game. So on initiative 20 or on your next turn, it refreshes. Because otherwise...
Well, that's what the reaction is for.
Yeah, and if you don't land a hit on your turn, you can still use it on your reaction. But if you hit on your turn, you can't use it on your reaction. That's how I used it, because otherwise you're getting 2 hits in one turn that are comparable to one good paladin hit. You know?
Yes, but the paladins have the spell slots. They can do it. They can smite on their extra attack on top of their normal attack as well.
And see, that's a way it's written in D&D that I don't use, because otherwise your paladins are one-shotting everything and everyone feels useless.
Unless you're a barbarian and the bosses have a crap ton of hit points.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, what you're talking about is basically
homebrew rules, but homebrew rules that, in my opinion, make it more fair for everyone else. But going back to rogue, staying on topic, the rogue has a play style of get in, hit, get out, get in, hit, get out, get in, hit, get out. And sometimes you get in and you stay there because you haven't landed your sneak attack yet, or you're missing attacks, or you have advantage and you're doing damage, but someone else is doing more damage, so the boss isn't interested in you, or whoever you're hitting is just, you're missing. But the goal is to get in, get your sneak attack off every round if possible, and don't get hit. You have a lower hit point pool. You have a pretty high DC, or AC, I mean, because of your high dex typically with a rogue. So your main goal is get the sneak attack damage off. I can't stress that enough. I've seen too many rogues just try to hit something and not do any damage because they could have hit the guy 10 feet from them who is in melee combat with the barbarian, but there's a guy on the other side of the room that they want to shoot with their crossbow or their hand crossbow. So they end up getting less damage overall when they could have got their sneak attack off and one-shot the guy the barbarian's dealing with, so that on the barbarian's turn, he can run up and deal with the other guy. So I can't stress it enough.
It's all about situational awareness.
It is situational awareness with the rogue. It is, who do I target? Because believe it or not, I believe, and through most of my experience, the rogues have the most consistent high damage. A lot of the other classes have pretty good high damage abilities, high damage spells, high damage hits every now and then, consistently high damage. But the rogue is the one that, when the rogue is hitting and landing his sneak attacks, even if it's fairly low rolls, you're really getting your damage out. And the sneak attack damage, I believe, Don't quote me on that, but I believe it does not count as bludgeoning, piercing, slashing, or magic. Like, I don't think you can be resistant to it. Either that or it counts as the same damage type as whatever weapon you used.
It doesn't say what it is. I'm looking it up right now.
I believe it's not resistance. I believe it just goes. Because that's the point, is you're caught off guard and it hits you in your weak spot.
Yeah, sounds about right.
That's how I rule it with the rogues I've had in my games. And because of that, rogues are strong. They hit like trucks when they hit. And one of the benefits of being in a rogue, and I think one of their biggest strengths, is having teammates. Rogues that are off in the corner by themselves, unless they're able to handle themselves, like your Battle Master rogue, which is a way to play and make it different. But if you're playing strictly rogue, having a team that works with you and can set up your sneak attacks and give you chances to land your hits are the bread and butter of the team comp.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And although they are big, I'd say they're big burst damage. I would say that they're consistent damage.
Yes, they are big burst, and they get that once per turn. Period. End of story. Wizards have to worry about having the spell slots to get a big hit in. Barbarians have to make sure they're raging. Monks have to make sure they have enough monk... what are they called? I'm going to call them monk...
Key points.
Key points. I was about to say monk points. They have to have enough monk key points. Fighters have to have enough action surges and superiority die, and they have a lot of utility. But rogues, once per turn, as long as they hit someone who meets those requirements, get bonus damage, and a lot of it. So sometimes it's actually a good idea to hold your attack action until after your barbarian's turn, so he gets in melee range with you, and as soon as he's there, then you get your crits. Then you get your sneak attack damage. Situational awareness and making sure you get your sneak attack. I've said it 100 times already, but I've seen too many rogues not get their sneak attacks and miss out on over half of the damage they could be dealing.
Yep.
So,
and that is, that's definitely the strengths of the rogue.
Is that
what
sneak
about
attack?
Weaknesses?
I think the weakness of the rogue is variety straight out. Early game, they really don't have a lot of variety. You get your sneak attack until you get your subclass. A lot of other classes, they're very similar. You don't really have a lot of variety until you get your subclass. But I think the rogue really suffers from that. Whereas other than just having their sneak attack, nothing really sets them apart in combat until level 3. They get their subclass, then they start getting some of their bonus action abilities and more sneak attack damage that really starts to set them apart, especially once you get, I think, 3d6 or 4d6 basically every turn. That's when you start to really realize, oh, wow, I'm hitting hard. I'm really doing damage. So their weakness is the early game, and their weakness is once they are hit, once they are surrounded, they're kind of screwed. So situational awareness and positioning in 5e combat is really important for a rogue. You don't want to get caught out. You're pretty hard to hit, but once you are hit and surrounded, and once you have a status effect on you, you're kind of stuck. Whereas fighters, monks, and barbarians have ways to get out of that. And I'll also put paladins in that list of having ways to get out of it because of their high saving throws.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
So,
although rogues at level 2, you get your level 5 you get your uncanny dodge, but at level 2 you are able to disengage, dash, or hide as a bonus action. At level 2 you can disengage and then run.
Yes, which really assists them being able to get in, get out. Get your damage off, get out, or avoid being in that bad situation before you're surrounded. Getting out of being surrounded before you are surrounded. And the rogue gets abilities that help them do that, But if you're not using them properly, you're going to find yourself hurt, going down a lot, and not getting your sneak attacks off. So,
which means that you are going to lose out on all that delicious
all
damage.
of that delicious damage. So, strengths of the rogue, damage. Consistent-ish burst damage. It's consistent if you make it consistent and you have a party that knows you're a rogue and assists you in getting those sneak attacks off. And not
to mention that you can use your bonus action to hide. If you're able to go up and hit somebody, you can use your bonus action to either dash away or to disengage and then leave the area without provoking an attack of opportunity.
And then get out of sight.
But if there's a table right there, you can hit somebody, walk 5 feet behind a table, and then attempt to hide, and then get advantage on your next attack.
Yeah. Which can turn the tide of fights quickly. So the strengths, damage, and more than it seems, damage. And then their real weakness is being surrounded in combat. Specifically in combat, remember, we're not talking really about RP stuff. Specifically in combat, their one real weakness is getting surrounded. They do not do well once they've used their bonus action to disengage and they're surrounded after that. There's really not much they can do other than hope people don't hit their AC.
And there's still the lack of magical damage on most of the melee subclasses of Rogue.
Correct. Arcane Trickster is fun.
You do have Arcane Trickster. You do have Inquisitive, Mastermind.
Correct.
A couple different ones. But also some of the subclasses like Thief or more mobility and less combat related. Scout gives you, a couple different abilities that will help you kind of initiating combat and staying out of combat.
Mm-hmm.
But specifically for the combat, unless you're using like a soul knife or an arcane trickster, you are going to need to find a magical weapon sooner rather than later, ideally before level 5.
Well, counterpoint to that, as we mentioned earlier, I don't think the sneak attack damage is resistible. So they have
that is true.
The variety of damage, quote unquote, with the sneak attack damage. If that's how the DM rules it.
Weapon damage.
If the DM rules it that way, I would say they have the most consistent damage to most enemies as long as they're able to hit.
No, the more I read this, it says you deal an extra 1d6 damage. The amount of extra damage increases as you gain levels. The fact that it says extra damage instead of a different type of damage, I think it's going to be weapon damage.
That does track. So, depending on how your DM rules it, they can be very, very good in terms of getting past resistances. However, I would still play it safe and try to get something that applies some kind of status effect. Some kind of weapon that applies a status effect. And that's kind of up to your DM to give it to you.
Or it's just magical for the sense of bypassing immunities and resistances.
Correct.
So even a +1 could work.
Correct. I believe that's all of the true melee classes. There are a couple that have secondary things. I believe paladins to be a melee class, but because of them being half casters by default, we've left them out of this melee portion and plan to put them in a magical portion or even the ranged portion. But
right now they're half casters. I mean, there are a lot of different subclasses that will bring other classes into a melee pool, if you will. Yeah, I mean, you have like the Blade Singer Wizard is a melee wizard. You have the paladins that not only do they get the extra attack and can use great weapons, but you also get their smite using their spell slots that will give you that magical damage, especially it being radiant does a lot of damage against undead.
Yes.
You have like the melee druids if they want to go into, bear form. You have the rangers that can be a melee ranger as opposed to just an archer ranger. You have like the Hexblade Warlock is another one. It's a melee caster. All their damage and everything comes from their charisma modifier.
Right.
There are a bunch of different ways that you can play melee that aren't true melee classes, meaning just strictly physical until you get a magical weapon.
Yes.
But they all kind of have the same pros and cons being melee versus being ranged. You have to be up close and personal. And if you're
Yes.
getting overwhelmed by a horde, you have, the chance that you'll be surrounded.
Yes.
So
And some
the
of
true
those
melee,
some of those alternative classes, I think you were about to point on this. Some of those alternative options don't do well up close with big hordes, especially like Bladesinger wizards, warlocks. They really don't do well when surrounded. They don't have the abilities to deal with it like a monk barbarian do.
yes, and that's where I was going with this, is the
Yeah.
overall benefits of true melee classes and why they're fun. You can, for the most part, run into the middle of a group of enemies and have enough tools that you can go in and survive a couple rounds and put out a decent amount of damage. As an alternative melee class, such as the Hexblade or the Bladesingers, that might not be as easy to do. So the true melees are if you just want to run to the middle of the fray and just start swinging away and go balls to the wall. That is why that you would want to play a true melee class. It's good to have one because they tend to be, with the exception of monk and possibly rogue, your frontliners. They're the ones that are going to soak up all the damage, try and get the enemy's attention, and give you a body, give you a target to aim for that's not going after your healers, that's not going after your rogues or your rangers kind of in from the
Correct.
ranged.
So,
But that's why every class or every party wants to have at least one just melee, just
At
one frontliner at the very
least.
least.
yeah, my current campaign party was lacking both melee people, other than an NPC they have in the party who is not amazing in melee, especially against monsters. I have that NPC set up to be really good against humanoid enemies with weapons. He's like a blade master. He's really good 1v1. He can parry, but only against physical weapons, not claws and spells and stuff. So I have him set up that way. So he's really good in that one niche option. And both of their melee characters were out of the game for a bit. But now that they're back, there's a noticeable difference in how the party's structured in combat. Because they aren't running around trying to avoid damage anymore, they have someone standing in front of the big guy, keeping him from running to the mages. So it is very beneficial to at least have one. And I'm not normally one to say, especially in D&D, you have to have a good party composition. But having one of the base melee classes is so beneficial, especially once you get past the early game.
And again, you also want to have variety. If you have 2 or 3 paladins in a party, I mean, chances are the DM is eventually going to get sick and tired of having, you doing a whole bunch of damage, and you'll either stop getting long rest to get your spell slots back, or you're going to come up with something that is immune
to
radiant damage
completely.
and resistant to physical damage, and then you're just screwed.
Yeah. So, but in the end, melee can be very, very fun. But especially with some of the classes, you're the one who makes it fun. Fighter, you have to be the one to make it fun. Because it's very simple from the start, and it's very, very player driven. Monk is just fun in general because you get to do anything and everything. You get to run around, you get to hit things, you get to do some abilities, you get to stun people. Monk is very powerful, but it does have its weaknesses in some places. The Barbarian is very fun to just run up there, watch people hit you, and watch your health bar chip down 3 damage at a time because they're hitting you with physical attacks. That can be very fun and empowering to a player. The Rogue is very, very fun, but you have to get your sneak attack damage off or you're going to feel useless. And you're going to notice that when you go through an encounter and only land 1 or 2 sneak attacks versus an encounter where you land a sneak attack every single turn and are wiping health bars. You're going to feel the difference. So at the end of it all, after the breakdowns, whatever class is right for you is right for you. Whatever class you want to play is up to you. And it's kind of up to you to find your play style that's still fun and engaging. But there's a reason archetypes exist, because they work. And I don't like being the guy to say you have to play this way, but it'll
just be a lot easier
if at least
one person does
the base archetype, and they can put their own spin on it. You want to play a fighter that's also a rogue and runs in there. You're being a tank, you're running in there and doing damage, and you're taking damage to some degree, but you also have your own spin on it. You have your rogue where you can get sneak attacks on enemies you've downed with your trip. You have a barbarian that likes to run in there and has AoE fire damage because that's his play style. You just have to make it your own, because a lot of the melee classes suffer from lack of magic, and they suffer from being able to be overwhelmed, aside from the barbarian, in my opinion. So just keeping that in mind and thinking about what your weaknesses are and how you can overcome them or avoid them can really step up your game and let you be able to express yourself and have fun in combat outside of RP.
I think that's a great conclusion.
That is a wonderful session, I think. So, you have any final thoughts on melee DPS and play styles in Dungeons and Dragons?
I love being a melee in Dungeons and Dragons. Most of my characters are either supposed to be in melee range because I have a really high AC, or they are melee damage.
Right.
I do want to play a full caster at some point, but because of the fact that melees just do so much consistent damage with the barbarians or the fighters, just that extra attack plus whatever bonus damage they can get, they don't have to track as many resources because they just automatically get bonuses to their damage. They get bonuses to their actions, such as the extra attacks. It just seems like if you want to play a damage dealer, melee seems to be the biggest consistent damage dealer type or archetype in the game.
Correct.
Mages, wizards, sorcerers, warlocks, they all have huge damage.
It's dependent on saving throws, and it's dependent
on saving throws. It's dependent on resources.
Yes.
And I've calculated a number of different min-max type archetypes, and I found that the most damage I can do in a turn, and I haven't seen anything that's been higher than this, is 4 rogue, 4 ranger, 12 fighter.
Right.
And it can deal in excess of, if everything crits, again, big kind of
the perfect scenario.
The perfect scenario, nothing that I have found can beat that 4 fighter or 4 rogue, 4 ranger, 12 fighter at, I think it was 2,093 damage in one turn.
Jesus Christ. Yeah, and I don't allow min-maxing my games for that reason.
Well, that is at level 20. That is with a couple different variables. There's like 3 criteria that need to happen.
Very powerful weapon that might not be in your game. Everything crits. You have all the perfect abilities. Someone's set up and standing next to your guy, so you have
going
advantage.
First.
Oh, right.
Going first, you have the ability to hide and get an advantage. And when you get an advantage, all your hits are automatic crits because of I want to say it's Gloomstalker or with Ambusher.
Yep.
So, I mean, there's not a lot that has to happen as long as you have with one particular bow, which is a legendary bow. But again, level 20, there's a chance you may or may not have found it, depending on how generous your DM is. But I think melee damage is the biggest, most consistent damage type in the game.
Yeah.
As long as they're not resistant to physical damage, melee is the way to go if you want to put out the big numbers.
Yeah. That is definitely a thought to leave on for newer players and even older players that really just dabble in melee and don't particularly like it. I'm one of those. I am a caster at heart in every game I play. I really love playing casters. Side caveat to one of my more recent characters that I almost got to finish playing, but that's my play style. And next session, we are going to be talking about ranged combat. Are we including casters in that?
It's going to be ranged physical, not magical ranged.
All right, ranged physical. We're going to do next session. Keep an ear out for that. We will be posting on various Discords, working on getting Twitter and other things set up for this if it keeps going. However, both of us have full-time jobs, and it can get in the way sometimes. So beyond that, is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, I mean, just kind of plugging our channels. Tomorrow, I know you've got your campaign that's going to be streamed. Tales of...
No, Across Aurelia.
Across Aurelia, excuse me.
And that'll be on my Twitch channels, Smug_F5 on Twitch. Starts at 7 p.m. CST, 6 p.m. Pacific, or not Pacific, Atlantic.
5 p.m. Pacific.
5 p.m. Pacific. And then let's go ahead and get it in there.
And then the Western Winds campaign starts at 8 o'clock Pacific or 11 o'clock EST.
Yeah.
And that's going to be a 4-hour session. And then finally, I've got my cooking stream on Saturday, which should be a lot of fun.
Oh, yeah. I remember you. Someone said something about that. I don't remember who. I don't think it was you that told me about it.
Might have been Ruben, I think.
I may have seen a message from Ruben about it. But yeah, I plan to try to stream Elden Ring again at some point this week. I've had a lot of problems with performance when trying to stream or record it. So I'll see what I can do to mitigate and fix that. After our 2 episodes left of Magic and Ranged Physical, I should be close to done enough on Elden Ring that I want to take a step back from D&D and talk about video game RPGs and give a breakdown of my thoughts on Elden Ring. That'll probably be 2-3 weeks out from now. But keep an eye and ear out for that. A lot of people are playing it right now, and I want to get a full scope and thought process on the game before I break it down, mostly spoiler-free. So that is going to be something to keep an eye and ear out for, and I will be announcing that in the future. So if there's nothing else to add, we'll see everyone next week. We'll be talking about ranged physical damage. This has been the SideQuestRPG podcast, the place to sit down, talk about D&D, RPGs, and everything in between. This is Smug signing off.
And the Mind's Eye. Take care, everyone.
See ya.